Leading Ideas Talks podcast is brought to you by the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Subscribe free to our weekly e-newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leadingideas. Leading Ideas Talks is also brought to you by Leading the Church in a Post-Pandemic Culture, a new Doctor of Ministry and Church Leadership focus from Wesley Theological Seminary and the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. With this track, clergy will receive the enhanced knowledge, skills, and motivation to increase congregational and denominational service, vitality, and growth in the post-pandemic world. Learn more and apply by February 15th for May 2023 at churchleadership.com/dmin. And remember, to stay up to date with the latest church leadership strategies and information, please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos. How can you lead effectively given the inherent messiness of congregational life? In this episode, leadership expert Mike Bonem speaks about the art of leading change, responding to those who resist change, and how leading well depends on having the courage to allow yourself to be changed.
I'm Ann Michael. I'm a senior consultant with the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary. I'm one of the editors of Leading Ideas e-newsletter, and I'm so pleased to be the host for this episode of Leading Ideas Talks. I'm talking today with Mike Bonem, who's a consultant and a coach and an author who's worked with churches and church leaders for over 2 decades. Earlier in his career, Mike worked with the McKinsey & Company, and he holds an MBA from Harvard Business School. He's the author of several books. One of his classics, which has been a huge help to me, is Leading from the Second Chair. But his most recent book is The Art of Leading Change, 10 Perspectives on the Messiness of Ministry. And that's the focus of our time together today, Mike. So welcome to you.
Thanks so much, Ann. I'm pleased to be here and really appreciate your work with the podcast and with Leading Ideas. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great. So early in your book, you state that the work of leading change in the church is always messy. And that's really the premise of your book. And so I wanted to give you a chance to elaborate on that theme.
Yeah, it is messy. I think the readers will all immediately identify with that idea because leadership is all about people. And people come into our lives in the church in all sorts of different ways. Some of them are ready for change. Some of them are reluctant to change. Some of them are deeply invested in the work of the church. Some are not. Some are very mature believers. Some are not. And they bring all of that and whatever past experiences they may have had with the church into the current context. And that just makes for a pretty messy leadership equation, particularly when we're talking about change. And frankly, there's not a church in the country right now that is not looking at some sort of change, sometimes dramatic, sometimes small, but we're all faced with change right now.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that struck me thinking about this issue of the messiness of change is that you know, you're beginning with this assumption that leadership is almost inherently messy, but at the same time, you really outline a perspective on change that's quite thoughtful and deliberate and planned. And at some level, that struck me as paradoxical because we think of messiness as the antithesis of orderly, purposeful change. But I think your book helped me see that something can be both orderly and purposeful and messy at the same time. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. Well, yes. I don't think that the book it suggests that the book does not suggest that we could just eliminate messiness. I'm just trying to give us some tools to make it a bit more orderly, a bit less messy, and to allow leaders to see ways to make progress through the mess. So yes, I think it can be both.
Yeah, you use throughout the book, you use the metaphor of art. And you talk about painting and sculpting and about how those arts necessarily involve mess, even though they are creative and constructive and follow their own norms in terms of how things happen. I thought that was really helpful to think about how something can be both messy and purposefully directed at the same time.
Yeah, and one of my favorite art examples that relates to that is the sculpting, right? Mm-hmm. The work of a sculptor is, especially if you think about working with any kind of stone, is inherently messy. You're chipping away, you're creating dust. You can't do that work without ending up at the end of a workday just covered in what you chipped away. And I think that imagery is also instructive for leaders, that there's the potential that we chip away too much. And so knowing exactly when and how to chip away, what to work on, what not to work on, when to step back and say the work is finished, at least for now, I think is all instructive from a leadership standpoint.
Right. And so one of your other sort of key metaphors in the book is that leadership is an art, not a science.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, the part of the backstory on that, the very first book that I had the opportunity to co-author with a couple of friends, the title is Leading Congregational Change. And when I had opportunities to speak on the content of that book afterwards, I almost always started my presentation by saying, I'm going to talk mostly about the science of leading change today, which is more about process and can give the appearance of being very straightforward and very linear and very clean and nice and neat and orderly. And really my reason for coming back and writing this book on the art of leading change was to just recognize how messy that leadership task is, and to step away from some of that science and to delve into the complexities that are always involved in leading change.
Yeah. So, a lot of the books that I've read on church leadership over the years will make the point that, conflict isn't necessarily bad. It can be generative, that leadership is messy, and that, chaos is the medium of creation, at least if you're God, right? And I've also experienced leaders that seem to think that the best way to provoke change is to just kind of stir the pot and upset the equilibrium of a system. So my question is this: is there a tipping point, a point at which messiness becomes sort of irredeemable or insurmountable, rather than being part of an expected process? I think we've all been in situations where a mess is just a mess, right. And not a good thing. and so I wonder, since you're working with this idea of the inherent messiness of leadership, when does messiness become bad?
No, I think that's a great observation. And yeah, I agree with the premise, right? That we can go too far, that it can become too messy, but sometimes that it really is just a mess. The very first of the 10 perspectives in the book is about trust. The title of the chapter is Lead with Trust. And I think that that's part of the answer to the question that you're asking, Anne. If our ability to lead and to even stir things up is highly dependent on how much people trust us, or our ability to lead well, at least in those situations. And so someone who just comes in and stirs the pot but doesn't have that relational capital is very likely to create, in your words, an irredeemable mess, right? You look around and people aren't following. You have a great idea, but you wonder why people are not excited about it. And a lot of times it's because you haven't invested in the relational capital, or you've drawn down the relational capital too much. Todd Bolsinger, in his book, Canoeing the Mountains, says, without trust, there is no travel. And I think that's a really helpful phrase, right? If people don't trust you enough, then they're not going to go on this change journey with you.
Right. And they're not going to tolerate mess, right? I mean, I think people are willing to tolerate disorder when they believe that it's purposeful, as opposed to just chaotic. I Sometimes I have used the saying that when the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, sometimes it means that the Spirit of God is at work. I mean, sometimes it just means that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. But I do think that sometimes it means that, something new is happening, and that can be generative.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are a couple chapters in your book that deal with the subject of how to deal with people who oppose or resist change. And I think you've got some really great advice on that subject. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to speak about that.
Sure. The one chapter, the title is "Resistors Are Not the Enemy," and that was probably the idea as much as anything that compelled me into developing all of this into a book. Where our society in general is so polarized, and I deeply believe that the church ought to be an example of how we can act differently, how we can sit in pews and sit in classes and small groups with people who think differently and yet not immediately label them as the enemy. And yet, unfortunately, a lot of those societal trends have crept into the church. And so, I think the idea that we need to hang on to, especially in leadership, is that just because someone asks a question about a new idea or maybe even registers some kind of resistance to it does not make them our enemy. My experience with churches is that the vast majority of the time when someone is voicing some level of opposition, it's not because they're an inherently evil person. I mean, we're all fallen, we're all sinful, but they're not voicing that opposition because their goal is to tear down the church. They're voicing that opposition either because they really aren't convinced of the rightness of the idea, because maybe sometimes out of fear. Sometimes they're voicing that opposition because they see something very different than the leader sees that's important to be considered. Mm-hmm. But none of those things make them an enemy. And so if we can really listen to those opposing ideas and embrace the human being behind them, we have a much better chance of forging a great path forward that will include them rather than starting to exclude them and potentially even divide the church in the process.
Yeah, I sometimes have used the motto in my work that when, there's someone who is objecting to something or standing in the way of something that I'm trying to accomplish, I'll use the saying, that person has just become my new best friend. Because, rather than try to push them away or vilify them, that's not going to accomplish what I need to accomplish. I need to figure out how to work with the person whose support I need on something. And I've really trained myself to think that way. And I think it's been one of the most important things, because the opposite of that is sort of allowing yourself to vilify somebody who may be essential to what you're trying to do. And that's counterproductive.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
But you also talk about how leaders can't fall into the trap of trying to please everybody. And that's a perspective to keep in mind when dealing with people who oppose change as well. So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, two sides of the same coin, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm well aware from, 2 decades of work with ministries and ministry leaders that there's seems to be a disproportionate share of people in ministry leadership roles who kind of fall off on the side of being people pleasers, right? Wanting to keep everybody happy. And I get it in terms of the kinds of people who are called into ministry and the kind of training they receive. But, that idea is not so much about, is really that to point out the dangers of waiting to get everybody on board. If we wait to get 100% support for a significant change in a church or a ministry, what we will tend to do is wait an inordinately long time and or really water down the idea to try to get to a lowest common denominator. And ultimately, I don't think that either one of those, in many cases, are what God would want us to do. It sets us up for a lot of disappointment and very little progress if we wait to get everybody on board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the other mottos I've used a lot is that consensus doesn't require unanimity. And I think there are a lot of people in churches that are paralyzed by the idea that in order to have a consensus around a decision, 100% of people in the church need to agree with that. And that's really paralyzing often, because it's an unrealistic idea.
Yeah, in my consulting work, I'll often have that exact conversation because I'm surprised at how often people equate consensus and unanimity.
Right.
And I mean, from a dictionary standpoint, they do not mean the same thing.
Right. Right.
And consensus, I think, bothers some people because it's sort of a mushy term. It's not just majority.
Right.
So what is it? But I also think it's a great spiritual concept, right? I mean, so you look at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, and ultimately they say it seemed right to the Holy Spirit and to us to not require the Gentile believers to adhere to all of Jewish practices. It doesn't say that it was unanimous.
Right.
It doesn't say we took a vote. It says it seemed, and I think that's a model of consensus, really, right? We didn't vote. We didn't necessarily wait for unanimity, but ultimately it seemed right to the Holy Spirit and to us. And is that a little bit mushy? Is that a little bit unclear? Well, what percentage of people is that? Is it a 2/3 supermajority? No, it's consensus.
Right. And that's actually one of the things that I teach in some of my leadership classes is how do you drive a consensus? What can a leader do since it is mushy, right? But there are skills that people can use in driving consensus. And I think making what the objective is and how to get there clear to a leader is really a helpful tool set. I want to move on to another subject. As I read your book, I was very aware that sort of underlying your discussion of leadership change is a particular model of change that begins with a leader, and then the leader gets the approval of other key leaders, and then they communicate the change more broadly, and they recruit other people to implement the change. In fact, it led me to pull off my shelf John Cotter's book, because it really seemed like it was a change process that echoed that to me. It's a very classic change theory. It's a very good change theory. But it also struck me that it's kind of a top-down model of leadership. It assumes one leader and many followers. And, in my experience, at least, a lot of the more significant changes that I have seen happen in churches don't necessarily start with one key leader. Sometimes change bubbles up in a more decentralized, bottom-up kind of way. And I have written and thought quite a bit about the subject of how the church might embrace a more decentralized, inclusive, bottom-up, if you will, understanding of congregational leadership. So I wanted to give you a chance to speak to that.
I appreciate your observation. So I'm going to say something that probably sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. So bear with me. I do think that pastors are in a unique role in their leadership in a church. And years ago, George Barna, in one of his books, talked about how many pastors did not have the gift of leadership, and so he proposed, well, let them use the gifts they have, and other people need to lead. And I thought that was a fairly an insufficient and short-sighted kind of observation, because people do look to the pastor to provide some significant leadership. Having said that, I do not believe in a kind of Moses model of pastor, right? Go to the mountaintop, hear what God's vision is, and then come down and tell all the people and expect them to follow. And that's not at all what I'm trying to communicate in the book. So I do think that pastors spend a lot more time thinking about the issues in the church and have some unique insights about how to lead it. But, one of the chapters in the book is titled Heavy Loads Require Strong Teams. And that was really geared towards, how do we have a more collaborative style of leadership that involves the input of other leaders in the church in deciding what the right steps to take are, where we're headed, and then enlist their support in making that happen. So I do think pastors are in a unique role, but I don't believe in that purely top-down model of leadership at all.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't agree with you more that pastors need to be leaders. And I mean, that's what we're all about at the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. But I think, going along with that is an understanding that everyone is a leader in a sense in the church. I mean, everyone has some gift to contribute to the work. And so I think finding a balance between those different leadership perspectives is challenging, in part because our cultural models of leadership tend to be so top down, and frankly, some of our polity is too dependent on your tradition. And so it's just always a question I think about, because I do think that change often happens in more organic ways as well, and that may be part of the messiness of it too. Along that line, I wanted to shift gears a bit and talk about the post-pandemic reality. I know you wrote this book during the pandemic, and pandemic was a great time to write a book. I wrote a book during the pandemic too.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask, how has the experience of the pandemic and this period in which so many churches were really forced to adopt new practices almost overnight, has that changed your understanding of how change happens in churches?
I thought in the first year or so of the pandemic that we were going to have this great opportunity to do some pretty fundamental rethinking of leadership in churches and how we would be church and what that would look like going forward. What I've sensed over the last 12 months is that a lot of that energy and creativity around let's do things really differently has been overwhelmed by the concerns about people aren't coming back, or what does our budget look like, or the people that are coming back are just asking us to go back to the way it was before the pandemic. And so my fear is that we've missed, or maybe are missing an opportunity to do some deeper rethinking. I think what we proved that we could be nimble at a tactical level in those first few months of the pandemic. Churches that I would have thought, small churches that I would have thought they're never going to be able to do something online, prove that large and small churches adapted in that respect really well. But the deeper kinds of changes that would ultimately, I think, help them to engage more effectively with their community, thinking differently. How do we reach people that are not coming to church? How do we connect with people for whom the pandemic was really a deep, soul-shaking experience, but who don't identify as Christian? How do we connect with them? I don't see a lot of churches doing that deeper work right now, and I wish they would.
Yeah, no, I share your view that I think churches have been very quick to try to get back to the old normal, as opposed to trying to think about what the new normal is. I guess really at the heart of the question I asked was this idea that disruptive change. That the pandemic probably was a pretty good example of change being initiated by disruption, and perhaps the fact that a pandemic eventually runs its course means that it wasn't a true disruptor. But I kind of wanted to think about that idea in relation to your ideas. If how much of change, real change, can happen through disruption as opposed to the kind of processes that you've outlined.
Well, there's no question that a disruption, whether it's a global disruption like a pandemic, or a very localized disruption, that something happens in the community around the church or in the church itself, is a great catalyst can be a great catalyst for change. I think what I'm grieving a bit is just what you said. I mean, the I don't know when we say the pandemic is officially over, but it's not disrupting life in the church today the way it was 2.5 years ago.
Right.
Certainly, right? And so I think because that disruption is mostly in the past, it's created this opportunity for people to be asking questions more around how do we get back to the way it was, as opposed to how do we embrace some sort of new normal.
Yeah. And it's probably not just the church that's in that place.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Yeah.
I mean, I think lots of organizations are thinking about or sort of caught in that same mindset. I found the conclusion of your book very compelling, where you wrote about the fact that someone can't really lead change in an organization without the courage to open themselves up to the possibility of being personally changed. And so that corporate change goes hand in hand with personal change. If I'm saying, I mean, maybe I'm not summarizing that correctly, but I found that really rang true to me, and I found that to be a compelling way to sort of end your discussion about change. So I wanted to give you a chance to speak to that.
Well, I think you summarized it quite accurately, and actually that chapter was in an early draft was the start of the book, and I had one of the people who reviewed it for me said, "What if you put that at the end?" And I do think that's, obviously that's where I concluded that it belonged. That we can think about all these issues of leading change and congregational change, corporate change, however you want to say it. But ultimately, it does come back to our willingness to change ourselves, and it's a spiritual process, and that's a big part of what I tried to describe in that chapter. Is that the change needs to begin with us, but our change needs to be driven by what God is doing in our lives, and you can't. I just don't have a theology that says that God, works a change in us and then we're done, right? And I think that's even though I'm not United Methodist, that's a pretty Wesleyan concept of sanctification, I think, right?
Right.
And I think that back to your question about top-down leadership. The people in our churches are smart. And if they sense a leader who is trying to dictate change from on high, but he or she is not willing to change on their own, if they sense that that kind of spiritual work is not going on in the life of the leader, and the God is not shaping and changing them, they're going to be much more resistant to whatever change that the lead and I don't know, this kind of that top-down model again, but whatever change the leader is proposing. And so I think it's critically important.
Yeah, no, and it did occur to me that it does loop back to this question of inclusivity in leadership, because when you talk about the ways that a leader opens him or herself up to personal change in the process of change, it's through listening to others, it's through including people on the team who may have different views than they do, and so forth. And so you're really talking about some of the collaborative aspects of leadership, and thinking about, how a leader makes themselves vulnerable and open to others, and in the process of change. So I really did appreciate that part of the book. As we wrap this up, one thing I often do when I talk to people is ask them, either how people can get started, or, one good piece of advice for people. And so if a new church leader were coming to you, and based on this and your other work, if you wanted to give them, one piece of good advice or one first step that they might take, what would that be?
I would probably ask a lot more questions before I would give advice, because that's how I'm trained, right? I mean, I really do. I do think that the advice is always context specific to who the leader is and this context in which they're serving. Having said that, the thing that immediately came to mind for me as you asked that question, Ann, is I would say schedule some time away.
Mm.
Go to whatever your favorite retreat setting is. And if you don't have one, find one. But get some time away and spend some time reflecting on your own leadership, listening to God, and getting as much clarity as you can, because the change journey, and some of this goes to that last chapter that we were talking about just a second ago. I think we have to ask the question, God, what changes do I need to make to be able to lead well? I believe that the change journey that I'm talking about needs to, in terms of the congregation, needs to be spirit-led. And so, there are a whole lot of us, myself included, often, who have bought into this idea of just constant busyness, right? My worth is defined by how busy I am. How many times do we have a conversation with somebody and say, "How are you doing?" "Oh, I'm great. I'm just so busy right now." I mean, that's a badge of leadership success, to be incredibly busy.
Right.
And what that means, we don't have time to listen to God and to let God do the transforming work that God wants to do in our own lives, and possibly give some real clarity about what the right next steps are for leadership. So I think the one piece of advice, back to your question, that I might give to somebody is spend that time away and then see where God takes you. And then the second piece of advice, and this goes to your question about collaborative leadership, is start to get some people around you who not who are always agreeing with you, but who are at least equally open to where God might be leading the church, and who would explore that with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great advice. Mike, I want to thank you for this conversation. Thank you for this book, because I think it will be tremendously helpful to people, but really for your entire body of work, your other books, as well as your other work in the field of church leadership. I'm just so appreciative for your witness and your work. Again, the book is The Art of Leading Change, 10 Perspectives on the Messiness of Ministry. So wish you luck with the launch of this book and appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Ann. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for joining us for Leading Ideas Talks. Please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos. Subscribe free to our weekly e-newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leadingideas.